She was the daughter of one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, but at 7 years old, all she wanted was someone to notice her pink dress and ask about her favorite toy. He was a single father working 3 jobs just to keep his head above water, but when he saw a little girl sitting alone at a birthday party, crying silent tears while surrounded by laughter, something in his heart wouldn't let him walk away. What happened next would expose a truth so heartbreaking about wealth, neglect, and the price of success that it would change both their lives forever. This isn't just a story about money or status. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, when the world has taught us to look away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It's about how sometimes the most important connections happen between the most unlikely people. If stories like this speak to your soul, we'd love to have you stay. And now, let the story begin. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn of the Riverside Country Club, where perfectly manicured hedges formed geometric patterns around a sprawling terrace dotted with white linen tables. Crystal glasses caught the light, like tiny prisms, and the sound of polite laughter mixed with the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. It was the kind of place where everything looked effortless, but cost more than most people made in a month. Marcus Rivera adjusted his black polo shirt for the 3rd time as he walked through the ornate iron gates, his 8-year-old son Danny bouncing beside him with barely contained excitement. The boy clutched a carefully wrapped gift box that had taken Marcus nearly an hour to perfect the night before, folding and refolding the corners until the paper lay smooth as glass. "Remember what we talked about," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting gently on Danny's shoulder. "Best behavior, say please and thank you. And if anyone asks what I do for work, you manage logistics for the city." Danny finished with a grin. "Got it, Dad." Marcus smiled despite the knot in his stomach. It wasn't exactly a lie. He did coordinate routes and schedules, just not from behind a mahogany desk in a corner office. His logistics involved navigating traffic patterns in a delivery truck before dawn, understanding the intricate dance of loading docks and tight deadlines, and making sure packages reach their destinations intact. But at a party like this, where conversations casually mentioned summer homes and private schools, the distinction felt important. The invitation had come as a surprise. Danny had been invited to Tyler Wellington's 8th birthday party, a classmate from the expensive private school that Marcus could barely afford thanks to a partial scholarship and his willingness to work weekends. When the elegant cardstock had arrived in their modest apartment mailbox, Marcus had stared at the embossed lettering and wondered if there'd been some mistake. "Dad, look at that." Danny's voice pulled Marcus from his thoughts. The boy was pointing toward an elaborate bouncy castle shaped like a medieval fortress, complete with turrets and flowing banners. Beyond it, Marcus could see a petting zoo set up near the tennis courts, where a small crowd of children were taking turns feeding goats while their parents sipped champagne and chatted in clusters. Pretty impressive, Marcus agreed, though. His eyes were scanning the crowd with the wariness of someone who'd learned to read rooms quickly. He recognized the polished confidence of wealth in the way the adults carried themselves, the casual designer clothing that probably cost more than his monthly rent, the easy laughter of people who'd never worried about whether their card would be declined at the grocery store. A woman in a flowing sundress approached them with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "You must be Danny's father," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Catherine Melbourne, Tyler's mother. We're so pleased you could join us." Marcus shook her hand, noting the way her gaze flickered briefly over his clothing before returning to his face. "Marcus Rivera. Thank you for inviting Danny. He's been talking about this party all week." "How wonderful," Catherine replied, though her attention was already drifting toward a group of women near the bar. "The children are gathering by the pool area for activities." Help yourselves to refreshments, won't you?" She glided away before Marcus could respond, leaving him with the distinct impression that he'd been politely but firmly categorized and dismissed. Danny, oblivious to the undercurrents, was already tugging on his father's hand. "Can we go see the animals, Dad? Please?" Marcus followed his son toward the festivities, noting how the other parents seemed to know each other with the familiarity of established social circle. Conversations flowed around topics he could only partially follow, discussions of private tennis instructors, boarding school applications, and vacation homes in the Hamptons. He found himself gravitating toward the edges of groups, smiling politely when acknowledged but mostly observing. The children, at least, seemed less concerned with social hierarchies. Danny quickly found himself drawn into a game of tag near the pool, his laughter mixing with the other kids' voices as they ran in circles around the elaborate poolside furniture. Marcus watched from a distance, a paper cup of lemonade in his hand, feeling that peculiar mixture of pride and protectiveness that came with watching his child navigate new social terrain. It was then that he noticed her. While the other children ran and played with the abandon of youth, one small figure sat alone on a stone bench near the garden's edge. She couldn't have been more than 7, with dark hair pulled back in an elaborate braid that suggested professional styling, and a pink dress that probably cost more than Marcus's weekly grocery budget. Her legs dangled from the bench, too short to reach the ground, and she was methodically tearing petals from a white flower, letting them fall to the manicured grass below. Something about her stillness in the midst of all the chaos struck Marcus as wrong. Children at birthday parties weren't supposed to sit alone, weren't supposed to have that particular weight in their shoulders that spoke of carrying burdens too heavy for small frames. He glanced around, looking for parents who might be keeping an eye on her, but the adults all seemed engaged in their own conversations. The little girl remained alone, forgotten in plain sight. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts about people, especially children, during his years as a single father. There was something about the way kids carried themselves when they felt invisible that he'd become attuned to, perhaps because he'd seen it in Danny during those first difficult months after his ex-wife had left them both behind for what she called a chance at a real life with real opportunities. He approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, careful not to startle. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. The little girl looked up, and Marcus felt his heart clench. Her eyes were the color of amber, and they held a sadness that no 7-year-old should carry. For a moment, she just stared at him as if she wasn't sure he was really talking to her. "I guess," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus settled onto the bench beside her, leaving plenty of space between them, but close enough to demonstrate that she had his full attention. "I'm Marcus," he said. "My son Danny is playing over there." He pointed toward the pool area where Danny was now engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game involving foam pool noodles and a great deal of splashing. The little girl followed his gaze, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued her methodical destruction of the flower, each petal falling like a tiny white flag of surrender. "That's a beautiful dress," Marcus said, and meant it. The fabric shimmered slightly in the afternoon light, and the attention to detail in the construction was obvious even to his untrained eye. "Pink's a good color on you." A ghost of a smile flickered across her face before disappearing again. "My daddy picked it out," she said. "His assistant ordered it online. He said it was appropriate for occasions like this." There was something in the way she said appropriate that made Marcus's chest tighten. It was a word that belonged in the vocabulary of adults discussing business strategies, not in the mouth of a child talking about her party dress. "Well, your daddy has good taste," Marcus said carefully. "Are you having fun at the party?" The little girl shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey volumes about resignation and loneliness. "It's okay, I guess. There are a lot of people here." Marcus glanced back toward the crowd of children and adults, seeing the scene through her eyes. What he'd initially read as festive celebration suddenly looked overwhelming, a sea of unfamiliar faces and loud voices that might feel more intimidating than exciting to a shy child. Sometimes big parties can be a little much, he agreed. Do you know Tyler well? The birthday boy? She shook her head. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not really. Daddy says it's important to attend social functions with families in our circle. He says networking starts early. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Networking. At a child's birthday party. He looked at this little girl, with her perfectly styled hair and her expensive dress and her vocabulary full of adult concepts, and saw something that made him want to scoop her up and carry her somewhere safe. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophia," she said. Sophia Ashford. The name clicked into place immediately. Ashford Industries was one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast, their logo visible on construction sites throughout the city. Marcus had delivered packages to their corporate headquarters more times than he could count, a gleaming 40-story tower that seemed to touch the sky. "Ashford," he repeated, understanding flooding through him. "Your father is Robert Ashford." Sophia nodded, but there was no pride in the gesture, no excitement at being recognized. If anything, she seemed to shrink slightly, as if the weight of that recognition was something she'd learned to bear rather than celebrate. "He's very important," she said in the same tone another child might use to recite a multiplication table. "He builds things and makes decisions and goes to meetings. His picture is in magazines sometimes." Marcus had seen those magazines in waiting rooms and lobbies, glossy publications that featured Robert Ashford in expensive suits, shaking hands with politicians and cutting ribbons at grand openings. In those photos, he'd always appeared supremely confident, the kind of man who commanded rooms and bent the world to his will through sheer force of personality and resources. But those magazines had never mentioned a daughter. "He must be very busy," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. "Very busy," Sophia agreed. "He travels a lot for work. Sometimes I don't see him for weeks." She paused, then added with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating painful truths. "Maria says that's just how successful people have to live. Maria, my nanny. She takes care of me when Daddy's working, which is most of the time." Sophia pulled another petal from her flower, watching it flutter to the ground. "She's nice, but she has her own family to worry about. Her real family." The casual way she said "real family" hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about Danny, about their nightly ritual of reading together before bed, about weekend mornings spent making pancakes and arguing over which cartoon to watch. He thought about the way his son's face lit up when he walked through the door each evening, about the homework sessions at their kitchen table and the impromptu dance parties in their small living room. Real family. As if what this little girl had was somehow a substitute, a pale imitation of the genuine article. "Where is your daddy today?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Sophia's shoulders rose and fell in another of those two adult shrugs. "He had a conference call with Singapore. Very important. He said Maria would bring me to the party and that I should represent the family well." She looked up at Marcus with those amber eyes that held far too much understanding. "I think I'm not doing a very good job." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, hot and protective and directed at a man he'd never met, but was rapidly learning to dislike intensely. "Why do you say that?" "Nobody's talking to me," Sophia said simply. "The other kids all know each other from school or their parents know each other. I don't really know anyone. Maria dropped me off and said she'd pick me up in 3 hours, but I don't think anyone even noticed I was here until you sat down." Marcus looked back toward the party, seeing it now through the lens of Sophia's experience. The children playing by the pool were indeed clustered in familiar groups, the easy camaraderie of established friendships evident in their interactions. The adults were similarly arranged, conversations flowing between people who shared common references and experiences. And in the middle of it all, a 7-year-old girl had been sitting alone on a bench, invisible despite her expensive dress and famous last name, tearing apart flowers while the world celebrated around her. "Well," Marcus said, making a decision that felt as natural as breathing, "I noticed you, and I'm very glad I did." Sophia looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "Really? Really, you seem like someone worth knowing." Marcus shifted slightly on the bench, angling himself so he could face her more directly. "Tell me something about yourself. What do you like to do when you're not at fancy parties?" For the first time since he'd approached her, Sophia's expression brightened slightly. "I like to read," she said. "And I like to paint, but only when Maria lets me use the good paints, not the washable ones. And I like to watch the birds that come to the window outside my room." "What kind of birds?" "Cardinals, mostly. And sometimes blue jays. There's one cardinal that comes every morning while I'm eating breakfast. I named him Charlie." She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "That's probably silly." "That's not silly at all," Marcus said firmly. "Naming birds shows you're paying attention to the world around you. That's a good thing. I bet Charlie appreciates having someone notice him." Sophia smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look like the child she should have been allowed to be. "Do you think birds can tell when people are watching them?" "I think birds are pretty smart," Marcus said. "And I think they can definitely tell when someone cares about them." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the party continue around them. Danny was now engaged in what appeared to be a water balloon fight, his clothes thoroughly soaked but his grin visible from across the lawn. Other children shrieked with delight as they chased each other around the elaborate playground equipment that had been set up near the tennis courts. "Your son looks like he's having fun," Sophia observed. "He is. Danny makes friends pretty easily." Marcus watched his son for a moment, then turned back to Sophia. "You know, I bet if you wanted to join in, those kids would be happy to have you play with them." Sophia shook her head quickly. "I don't think so. Besides, this dress isn't really for playing. Maria said I needed to stay clean for photos." "Photos?" "Daddy's publicist sometimes wants pictures of us together for magazines, to show that he's a family man." Sophia's voice took on that recited quality again, as if she were repeating words she'd heard but didn't fully understand. "It's good for his image." Marcus felt that anger rising again, more intense this time. He thought about the hundreds of photos on his phone, candid shots of Danny's daily life gap-toothed grins over ice cream cones, silly faces in grocery store mirrors, proud poses with school art projects. None of those photos had been taken for public consumption or image management. They existed simply because Marcus wanted to remember these moments with his son, because every stage of Danny's childhood felt precious and fleeting. The idea that this little girl's relationship with her father was filtered through publicists and image consultants made him want to drive straight to that gleaming corporate tower and have some very direct words with Robert Ashford. Instead, he focused on Sophia, on the present moment, and what he could do right now to make her feel less alone. "Well," he said, "what if we forgot about photos for a little while? What if we just focused on having some fun?" Sophia looked uncertain. "But my dress will still be beautiful even if it gets a little wrinkled," Marcus said gently. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can talk to me." Something in his tone seemed to reassure her, because she nodded slowly. "Okay. But I don't really know how to play the games they're playing." Marcus stood and offered her his hand. "Then we'll figure it out together. That's what friends do." Sophia stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if the concept of someone offering to help her was foreign and surprising. Finally, she reached out and took it, her small fingers feeling impossibly delicate in his larger palm. "Are we friends?" she asked as they walked toward the pool area. "If you want to be," Marcus said. "I'd like that very much." As they approached the group of children, Marcus called out to Danny, "Hey buddy, come here for a second." Danny bounded over, dripping wet and grinning widely. "Dad, you should see this place. They have actual peacocks." "Real ones. That's amazing," Marcus said, ruffling his son's damp hair. "Danny, I'd like you to meet my new friend Sophia." "Sophia, this is Danny." Danny's expression immediately shifted to one of welcoming interest. He had inherited his father's ability to read people, and Marcus could see him taking in Sophia's formal dress and quiet demeanor. "Hi, Sophia," Danny said, offering her a smile that was slightly more gentle than his usual exuberant grin. "Do you want to come play with us? Tyler's mom set up this whole obstacle course thing, and there are prizes." Sophia glanced up at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "I don't know if I'm very good at obstacle courses," she said. "That's okay," Danny said with the easy confidence of a child who had never doubted his ability to make friends. "Nobody's good at them at first. That's what makes them fun. Plus, if you fall down, the ground is all soft and squishy." Marcus watched as Danny took Sophia's other hand and began leading her toward the group of children who were lined up for what appeared to be an elaborate course involving pool noodles, hula hoops, and inflatable obstacles. He followed at a distance, close enough to intervene but far enough back to let the children navigate their own social interactions. What happened next surprised him. As Danny introduced Sophia to the other kids, several of them recognized her name and seemed genuinely excited to meet her. Not because of her father's wealth or status, but because children operated on a different frequency than adults, one where kindness and inclusion mattered more than networking opportunities. "Sophia, I know you," exclaimed a girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "You're in Mrs. Henderson's class at Sacred Heart." "I'm in Mrs. Martinez's class right next door." "I remember you," another boy chimed in. "You did that really cool presentation about birds last month. My class got to watch it on the video thing." Marcus felt a surge of pride on Sophia's behalf as he watched her face light up with recognition and pleasure. These children knew her not as Robert Ashford's daughter or as a networking opportunity, but as Sophia, the girl who did presentations about birds and attended Sacred Heart Academy. Within minutes, she was integrated into the group, her expensive dress forgotten as she navigated the obstacle course with growing confidence and increasing laughter. Marcus found himself grinning as he watched her carefully make her way through a tunnel made of pool noodles, her braid coming slightly undone and her cheeks flushed with exertion and joy. It was while he was watching this transformation that he felt a presence beside him. He turned to find a woman in an elegantly tailored blazer and pearls, her gray hair styled in a sophisticated bob that spoke of expensive salons and professional maintenance. "You must be one of the dads," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Eleanor Morrison. My grandson Tyler is the birthday boy." Marcus shook her hand, noting the way her gaze assessed him with the efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloging people based on their potential usefulness. "Marcus Rivera. My son Danny is in Tyler's class." "Of course," Eleanor said, though. Marcus suspected she had no idea who Danny was. Her attention was focused on the children playing near the pool, specifically on Sophia, who was now attempting to hop through a series of hula hoops while balancing a foam ball on her head. "That's Robert Ashford's daughter, isn't it?" Eleanor said, and there was something in her tone that made Marcus's protective instincts sharpen. "That's Sophia," he said carefully, emphasizing her name rather than her parentage. Eleanor's smile was the kind that wealthy women perfected through years of charity galas and society functions, pleasant on the surface but calculating underneath. Such a lovely child. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see her here without supervision. Robert's usually so careful about appearances. The way she said supervision made it clear she wasn't referring to safety concerns, but rather to social positioning and image management. Marcus felt that familiar anger rising again, but he kept his voice level. "She seems to be doing just fine," he said. Eleanor's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, of course, dear. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just that families in certain positions have to be so careful about associations, don't they? One never knows who might try to take advantage." The implication was clear and insulting, and Marcus felt his hands clench at his sides. Before he could respond, however, a shriek of laughter drew their attention back to the children. Sophia had successfully completed the obstacle course and was being cheered by the other kids, her face glowing with accomplishment and pure joy. As Marcus watched, she looked around until she spotted him, then waved enthusiastically, her earlier shyness completely gone. He waved back, and the smile she gave him in return was so bright it could have powered the entire country club. "She seems to have found her stride," Eleanor observed, and there was something almost grudging in her tone, as if Sophia's happiness was somehow unexpected or inappropriate. "Children usually do when they're given the chance," Marcus said pointedly. Eleanor's smile tightened slightly. "Yes, well, some children are raised to understand that certain behaviors are expected in certain settings. But I suppose different families have different approaches." Marcus turned to face her fully, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for moments when diplomacy was no longer an option. "You're right. Some families teach their children that other people's worth is measured by their bank accounts or their last names. And some families teach their children that everyone deserves kindness and respect, regardless of what they have or where they come from." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise at his directness, but before she could respond, Marcus continued. "I think Sophia is a remarkable little girl who deserves to enjoy this party just like any other child here. And if anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to discuss it with me." With that, he walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone with her pearls and her prejudices, and headed back toward the children. As he approached, Sophia ran up to him, slightly out of breath, but radiant with excitement. "Did you see me? Did you see me do the whole course without falling down?" "I saw," Marcus said, crouching down to her level. "You were amazing. I'm so proud of you." The words slipped out naturally, and he saw something flicker in Sophia's eyes: surprise, pleasure, and something that looked almost like hunger. As if praise and pride were rare commodities in her world, precious and unexpected gifts. "Really?" she asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question that made Marcus's heart ache. "Really," he said firmly. "You were brave and determined, and you cheered for all the other kids too. That shows real character." Sophia beamed at him, then impulsively reached out and hugged him around the neck. Marcus hugged her back gently, careful not to crush her delicate frame, and felt something shift in his chest. This little girl, with her expensive clothes, and her famous father, and her carefully managed life, was just a child who needed what all children needed: to be seen, to be valued, to be loved, for who she was rather than what she represented. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from feeling recognized and celebrated. "Can we play some more?" she asked. "As long as you want," Marcus promised, and meant it completely. The afternoon continued in a blur of games and laughter. Sophia threw herself into each activity with the enthusiasm of a child who had been given permission to simply be a child, rather than a carefully managed extension of her father's public image. She painted her face at the art station, getting more glitter on her dress than on the paper. She fed carrots to the goats at the petting zoo, giggling when one particularly bold goat tried to eat her hair ribbon. She participated in a relay race, coming in last but cheering loudest for the winners. Marcus stayed close, not hovering but available, watching this transformation with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Each laugh, each moment of uninhibited Play only emphasized how rare these experiences must be in Sophia's carefully orchestrated world. As the party began to wind down and parents started gathering their children and their belongings, Marcus noticed Maria approaching across the lawn. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and practical clothing, moving with the efficient purpose of someone accustomed to managing schedules and expectations. Sophia saw her coming, and her shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of returning to her structured world settling back onto her small frame. "Time to go?" she asked, though it was more resignation than question. Maria reached them with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Mia, but your father wants you home for dinner. He has guests coming, and you need to be cleaned up and presentable." Marcus watched as Sophia's expression shifted, the spontaneous joy of the afternoon fading as she remembered her role in her father's carefully constructed life. The transformation was heartbreaking, like watching a butterfly fold its wings and disappear back into its cocoon. "Of course," Sophia said, her voice returning to that too formal tone she'd used when Marcus first met her. "I should say goodbye. And thank Mrs. Melbourne for inviting me." "I already spoke with her," Maria said gently. "She understands you need to leave. But you should say goodbye to your new friends." Sophia turned to Danny, who had been building an elaborate sandcastle near the pool with some of the other children. "Goodbye, Danny. Thank you for being nice to me." Danny looked up, his face smudged with dirt and his clothes thoroughly destroyed by an afternoon of play. "Bye, Sophia. I hope I see you at school soon." Then Sophia turned to Marcus, and he saw her struggling with something. Some internal debate about propriety and expectations versus the genuine connection they'd formed. Finally, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Thank you for asking where my parents were," she said. "No one ever asks that." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Everyone should have someone who notices when they're alone," he said. "Everyone deserves that." Sophia nodded solemnly, as if filing away this piece of wisdom for future reference. Then, surprising him again, she reached into the small purse she'd been carrying and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I drew this during art time," she sighed, holding it out to him. "I wanted you to have it." Marcus unfolded the paper and found a crayon drawing of two figures, a tall man and a small girl sitting on a bench surrounded by flowers. At the top, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My friend Marcus." He stared at the drawing, overwhelmed by the simple gift and what it represented. In a world where this little girl was managed by assistants and nannies, where her relationships were filtered through publicists and social strategists, she had drawn a picture of friendship. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'm going to treasure it." Sophia smiled one last time, then allowed Maria to guide her toward the parking area, where a black sedan waited with a uniformed driver. Marcus watched them go, still holding the drawing, feeling like something important was slipping away. Danny appeared at his side, following his gaze. "She's nice," he said simply. "But she seems really sad." Marcus looked down at his son, seeing the same intuitive understanding in Danny's eyes that had drawn him to Sophia's bench in the first place. "Yeah, buddy. She does. Are we going to see her again?" Marcus thought about Sophia's world, the corporate towers and managed schedules, the nannies and drivers and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Then he thought about their world, their modest apartment and weekend grocery trips, their evening homework sessions and Saturday morning pancakes. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I hope so." As they gathered their own things and prepared to leave the country club, Marcus found himself holding onto the drawing like a lifeline. Somewhere in this city of millions, a little girl was returning to her gilded cage, carrying with her the memory of an afternoon when someone had simply sat down beside her and asked if she was okay. It was a small thing, perhaps, but sometimes the smallest gestures cast the longest shadows, and sometimes a single moment of genuine human connection could change the trajectory of everything that came after. Marcus didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of their story. And some beginnings, once started, have a way of writing themselves toward exactly the ending they were always meant to find. The corporate headquarters of Ashford Industries rose like a gleaming monument to ambition against the Seattle skyline, its 43 floors of steel and glass reflecting the gray October clouds that seemed perpetually suspended over the city. On the 38th floor, Robert Ashford stood behind his mahogany desk, one hand pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows as he surveyed the urban landscape below. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his early 40s, impeccably groomed, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was listening to his assistant, Jennifer Walsh, recite his evening schedule with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. Board meeting at 6. Dinner with the Yamamoto delegation at 8. Conference call with London at 11. And don't forget, Jennifer added, consulting her tablet, Sophia has her piano recital next Thursday evening. Mrs. Chun has been preparing her for months. Robert's hand stilled against the glass. Thursday evening? Yes, sir. 7 o'clock at the academy. It's been on your calendar for 6 weeks. Robert turned from the window, his expression shifting into the focused intensity that his business associates knew meant he was calculating odds and weighing priorities. What else do we have Thursday? Jennifer's fingers moved across her tablet screen. The quarterly review with the Henderson Group is scheduled for 7:30. It's the final presentation before they decide on the downtown development contract. How much is that contract worth? $47 million, sir. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he performed the mental arithmetic that governed his world. A piano recital versus a $47 million contract. A child's performance versus a deal that could shape the company's trajectory for the next 5 years. Reschedule the Henderson meeting, he said finally. Jennifer looked up in surprise. Sir, move it to Friday morning. Tell them something came up. Family emergency. Jennifer made notes on her tablet, but her expression remained puzzled. In the 3 years she'd worked for Robert Ashford, she could count on one hand the number of times he'd prioritized personal commitments over business opportunities. Is everything all right, Mr. Ashford? Robert sat down behind his desk, picking up a silver-framed photograph that showed him and Sophia at some corporate charity event. In the picture, they both wore formal clothes and careful smiles, posed with the practiced ease of people accustomed to public scrutiny. It looked more like a professional headshot than a family portrait. My daughter drew me a picture yesterday, he said, his voice taking on an odd quality that Jennifer had never heard before. It was stuck to the refrigerator when I got home from the Singapore call. Jennifer waited, unsure how to respond. It was a drawing of a man sitting on a bench with a little girl. There were flowers everywhere and birds in the trees. Robert set the photograph down, his fingers drumming against the desk. She wrote Daddy and me at the park across the top. That's sweet, sir. The thing is, Robert continued, staring at the photograph, I can't remember the last time I took her to a park. I'm not even sure she's ever been to a park, not a real one. We have the garden at the house, but that's different. That's landscaped and maintained and... He trailed off, seeming to realize he was thinking out loud. Jennifer remained silent, recognizing that her boss was working through something that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or contract negotiations. Maria mentioned that Sophia made a friend at the Wellington party last weekend, Robert said. Some man named Marcus Rivera. Apparently, his son goes to Sacred Heart too. That's nice that she's making friends. Robert picked up another paper from his desk, a background check that his security team had compiled as a matter of routine. It was standard procedure whenever Sophia interacted with new people, a precaution that had become second nature in his world of calculated risks and potential threats. Marcus Rivera, 34, single father, works for Pacific Delivery Solutions, Robert read aloud. Lives in a one-bedroom apartment in Fremont. Drives a 2018 Honda Civic with 130,000 miles on it. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no red flags. Sounds like a responsible person. His son Danny is on partial scholarship at Sacred Heart. Rivera works 60-hour weeks to cover the remaining tuition. Robert looked up from the report. Do you know what 60-hour weeks look like, Jennifer? I imagine it's exhausting, sir. I work 60-hour weeks, Robert said. But I do it from corner offices and first-class airplane seats and five-star hotel suites. This man does it driving a delivery truck through Seattle traffic. He set the report down. And somehow he still found time to sit with my daughter at a party when she was alone. The weight of that observation hung in the air between them. Jennifer had worked closely enough with Robert to understand the complexity of his relationship with fatherhood. The way his love for Sophia was filtered through layers of responsibility and expectation, and the constant pressure of maintaining an empire that employed thousands of people. Maria said Sophia talked about him for days after the party, Robert continued. She asked if we could invite Danny and his father over for dinner. When was the last time Sophia asked to have a friend over? Jennifer couldn't remember it ever happening. Robert stood and walked to another window, this one facing west toward the residential neighborhoods that sprawled between downtown and the Sound. Somewhere out there, in a modest apartment building, a delivery driver was probably helping his son with homework or making dinner or engaging in any of the small daily rituals that constituted normal family life. I've been thinking about something Maria said, Robert said. She told me that when she picked Sophia up from the party, my daughter was different. More animated, more engaged. She talked about games she'd played and friends she'd made, but mostly she talked about this man who had asked where her parents were. Asked where her parents were? Apparently, he found her sitting alone and wanted to make sure she wasn't lost or abandoned. Robert's laugh was bitter. Lost or abandoned. At a party she'd been invited to, where she was supposed to be representing our family's interests in the community. Jennifer remained quiet, sensing that her boss was working towards some kind of realization or decision. I built this company from nothing, Robert said, his voice taking on the tone he used in boardrooms when he needed to convince skeptical investors. When my father died, we had 6 employees and a handful of small contracts. Now we employ over 3,000 people, and our projects reshape entire neighborhoods. I did that by understanding that success requires sacrifice. He turned back toward his desk, but his gaze settled on the family photograph again. But somewhere along the way, I started treating my daughter like another asset to be managed, rather than a person who needs her father. The admission came out slowly, as if the words were difficult to form. And it took a stranger at a children's party to notice that she was sitting alone. Jennifer watched her boss carefully, recognizing that this conversation was more personal than anything they'd ever discussed. Robert Ashford was not a man who revealed vulnerability easily, but something about his daughter's friendship with Marcus Rivera had clearly shaken him. What are you thinking, sir? Robert sat down again, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his contacts. I'm thinking that I'd like to meet this Marcus Rivera myself. Not to interrogate him or run a deeper background check, but to thank him for seeing my daughter when I wasn't there to see her myself. Would you like me to arrange something? No, Robert said, making a decision. I think this is something I need to do personally. 3 days later, Marcus Rivera was finishing his delivery route in the industrial district south of downtown when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen while stopped at a red light, expecting to see dispatch with information about a pickup change or delayed delivery. Instead, he saw an unknown number with a local area code. Hello? Mr. Rivera, this is Robert Ashford. I believe you met my daughter Sophia at a birthday party last weekend. Marcus nearly dropped the phone. The voice on the other end was smooth and confident, with the kind of practiced authority that came from years of high-stakes negotiations and boardroom presentations. It was exactly what Marcus would have expected Robert Ashford to sound like. But hearing it directed at him personally was surreal. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, pulling into a parking lot so he could focus on the conversation. "Sophia is a wonderful little girl. I was hoping we might have the opportunity to speak in person." Robert continued, "I understand you work in this area of the city, and I was wondering if you might have time to meet for coffee this afternoon." Marcus checked the time on his dashboard. He had 2 more deliveries to complete before his shift ended, but his supervisor had been flexible about scheduling lately, and this was clearly not a request he could easily decline. "I could meet around 4:30 if that works for you." "Perfect. There's a coffee shop called Grind on 2nd Avenue near the Pike Place." "Market, do you know it?" "I can find it." "Excellent, Mr. Rivera. I want to be clear that this isn't any kind of formal meeting or interrogation. I simply want to thank you personally for your kindness to Sophia." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone and wondering what he'd just agreed to. In his experience, when wealthy, powerful men wanted to thank you personally for something, it usually meant they were either about to offer you money or threaten you with legal action. Neither prospect was particularly appealing. He completed his remaining deliveries in a distracted haze, his mind turning over possible scenarios for the upcoming meeting. Maybe Robert Ashford was concerned about his daughter forming friendships outside their social circle. Maybe he wanted to establish boundaries or make it clear that the Riveras and the Ashfords moved in different worlds. Maybe he was simply curious about the man who had spent an afternoon playing games with his daughter. By the time Marcus reached Grind, a trendy coffee shop wedged between a vintage bookstore and an artisanal soap boutique, he had convinced himself that this meeting was either going to be very good or very bad, with no middle ground possible. Robert Ashford was already seated at a corner table when Marcus arrived, and the contrast between them was immediately apparent. Robert wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence commanding even in the casual environment of the coffee shop. Marcus, still in his delivery company uniform with his name embroidered above the pocket, felt distinctly out of place. But when Robert stood to shake his hand, his smile was genuine and his grip was firm without being aggressive. "Mr. Rivera, thank you for taking the time to meet me. Can I buy you a coffee?" They ordered their drinks and settled back at the corner table, the afternoon light filtering through the large windows, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. For a moment, neither man spoke, both seeming to take the measure of the other. "I'll be honest," Robert said finally. "This is not a conversation I ever expected to have. But my daughter hasn't stopped talking about you and your son since the Wellington party, and I felt I owed you a personal thank you." Marcus relaxed slightly. "She's a special kid. Danny's been asking when he can see her again. That's actually part of what I wanted to discuss." Robert leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Maria told me about how she found Sophia at the party, sitting alone, not participating in the activities. She said you were the only adult who approached her, who took the time to include her." "She looked lonely," Marcus said simply. "No kid should feel invisible at a party." Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Rivera?" "Sure. What did you see when you looked at my daughter that day?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I saw a little girl who was trying very hard to be perfect, but who really just wanted someone to notice her. She was dressed beautifully and sitting perfectly still, but her eyes were sad. She looked like she was carrying weight that was too heavy for someone her age." Robert absorbed this, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid that's a more accurate assessment than I'd like to admit. Look, Mr. Ashford, I'm not trying to judge your parenting or tell you how to raise your daughter. I just know what it looks like when a kid feels alone in a crowd." "How do you know that?" Marcus hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only way to navigate this conversation. Because Danny went through a period like that after his mother left. She decided that being a single mom wasn't part of her life plan, so she moved to California and started over. For months afterward, Danny would shut down in social situations. He'd participate when forced to, but you could see that he felt different from other kids, like he was missing something essential that they all had. Robert's expression shifted, becoming more attentive. "How did you help him through it?" "Mostly by showing up," Marcus said. "Being present, being consistent, making sure he knew that even though his mom wasn't around, he still had someone who thought he was the most important person in the world." It took time, but eventually he started believing it again. "And you?" "Think Sophia needs someone to show up for her. I think Sophia needs to know that she matters to someone, not because of what she represents or how she reflects on your family, but just because she's Sophia." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "She told me that you travel a lot for work. She said sometimes she doesn't see you for weeks." Robert's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "My work requires extensive travel. I'm building something that will provide security for Sophia's future, for the futures of thousands of employees. Sometimes that means making sacrifices in the present. I understand that. But from where I sit, Sophia's present is pretty important too. She's 7 years old. She's not going to be 7 again." The words hung between them, not accusatory but clear in their implication. Robert stared out the window at the busy street, watching people hurry past with their afternoon errands and obligations. "You know what the hardest part is?" Robert said finally. "I love her more than anything in the world. Everything I do, every deal I make, every decision I sign off on, it's all for her. But somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing how to show her that in ways she could understand." Marcus felt a sudden surge of empathy for this man who had everything, but seemed to be struggling with the same fundamental challenge that every parent faced: how to balance providing for your child with being present for your child. "It's not too late," Marcus said. "Kids are resilient. They forgive quickly when they see genuine effort. I wouldn't even know where to start." Marcus smiled. "Start small. Start with what she's interested in. She told me she likes birds, that she watches them from her bedroom window. Maybe learn about birds. Take her to the zoo or the aquarium. Ask her to teach you about the things she's passionate about." Robert looked back at him, something shifting in his expression. "She mentioned birds to you?" "She has a cardinal she named Charlie that visits her window every morning. She lights up when she talks about him. I didn't know that." Robert's voice was quiet, almost wondering. "I've lived in the same house with her for 7 years, and I didn't know she had named the birds. Like I said, it's not too late." They sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Robert looked up with what might have been the beginning of hope in his eyes. "Would you and Danny like to come to dinner this weekend?" he asked. "Sophia has been asking, and I think it might be good for all of us." Marcus considered the invitation, weighing the potential complications against Sophia's obvious need for friendship and connection. "Are you sure? Our worlds are pretty different." "That might be exactly what we need," Robert said. "Different perspectives. Sophia certainly seems to thrive around you and your son." "Okay," Marcus said. "But fair warning, Danny's not used to formal dining. He's more of a chicken nuggets and chocolate milk kind of kid." Robert laughed, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, the sound was completely natural and unguarded. "Honestly, that sounds refreshing. We can order pizza and eat in the kitchen if that would be more comfortable." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "My personal number," he said, handing it to Marcus. "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call." Marcus looked at the card, feeling the weight of what was being offered. Not just contact information, but the possibility of genuine friendship between two men who had nothing in common except their love for their children. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that. No, Mr. Rivera, thank you for seeing my daughter when I wasn't looking closely enough to see her myself." As they walked out onto the busy sidewalk, Marcus felt like something significant had shifted. This meeting could have gone in a dozen different directions, most of them uncomfortable or confrontational. Instead, it had revealed a father who was beginning to recognize that success in business didn't automatically translate to success in parenting, and who was humble enough to accept guidance from someone who understood what his daughter needed. Later that evening, Marcus was helping Danny with his math homework when his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Sophia. Daddy gave me his phone to write to you. Thank you for being my friend at the party. Daddy says you and Danny are coming to dinner on Saturday. I can't wait to show Danny my bird books and my art supplies. Love, Sophia." Marcus smiled, showing the message to Danny, who immediately perked up with excitement about the upcoming dinner. As he helped his son finish his homework, Marcus found himself thinking about the afternoon's conversation with Robert Ashford. Change was possible, even for someone who had built walls around his heart in the name of professional success. Even for someone who had confused providing with parenting. All it took was the willingness to see clearly and the courage to try something different. And sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most important connections happen not despite our differences, but because of them. Because sometimes what we need most is exactly what we don't have, and sometimes the people best equipped to help us are the ones who come from completely different worlds. Saturday dinner at the Ashford house was going to be interesting, that much was certain. But as Marcus tucked Danny into bed that night and listened to his son's excited chatter about seeing Sophia again, he had a feeling that was going to be much more than interesting. It was going to be the beginning of something none of them had expected, but all of them needed. The Ashford estate sat on 3 manicured acres in the exclusive Highlands neighborhood, surrounded by towering evergreens that provided both privacy and the kind of natural beauty that money could purchase and maintain but never truly create. The house itself was a modern architectural masterpiece, all clean lines and expansive glass windows that offered panoramic views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. As Marcus pulled his aging Honda into the circular driveway behind a fountain that probably cost more than his annual salary, he felt Danny's nervous energy radiating from the passenger seat. "Dad, what if I say something wrong? What if I break something expensive?" Marcus turned off the engine and looked at his son, recognizing his own anxiety reflected in Danny's wide eyes. "Just be yourself, buddy. That's what Sophia likes about you. And if you break something, we'll figure it out together." The front door opened before they could ring the bell, and Sophia appeared wearing a simple yellow dress and sneakers instead of the formal attire Marcus had expected. Her face lit up when she saw them, and she bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement. "You're here. I've been watching for your car for 20 minutes. Behind her, Robert appeared in jeans and a casual button-down shirt, looking more relaxed than Marcus had ever seen him. The transformation was remarkable. Without the armor of his business attire, he looked younger, more approachable, more like an actual father than a corporate executive. "Welcome to our home," Robert said, stepping forward to shake Marcus's hand and ruffle Danny's hair. "I hope you're hungry." Sophia insisted we order from 3 different pizza places to make sure we had enough options. As they entered the house, Marcus was struck by the contrast between the exterior grandeur and the interior warmth. While the furniture was clearly expensive and the artwork museum quality, there were also signs of actual family life. Sophia's drawings displayed on the refrigerator, a basket of toys in the corner of the living room, books scattered across the coffee table. Sophia gave me a tour of the house this morning, Robert said, noticing Marcus's appreciative gaze. I realized I'd been living here for 5 years without really seeing it through her eyes. Did you know she has a reading nook built into the bay window in her room? I had no idea she'd even discovered it. Sophia grabbed Danny's hand and began pulling him toward the stairs. Come on. I want to show you my room and my art studio and the library. Hold on there, sweetheart, Robert said gently. Let's eat. First, the pizza will get cold, and I'm sure Mr. Rivera and Danny are hungry. They gathered around the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room, sharing pizza directly from the boxes and drinking soda from cans rather than crystal glasses. The informality seemed to work magic on everyone's comfort level. Within minutes, Danny was chattering about school and soccer practice, while Sophia shared stories about her piano lessons and her latest art project. I'm painting all the birds that come to my window, she told Danny excitedly. So far I have 7. Different kinds. Daddy bought me a bird identification book, and we've been looking them up together. Marcus glanced at Robert, who was watching his daughter with an expression of wonder and pride that suggested this shared bird research was a recent development. Show him the cardinal painting, Robert encouraged. The one you finished yesterday. Sophia ran to retrieve a small canvas from the adjacent room, returning with a watercolor painting that was surprisingly sophisticated for a 7-year-old's work. The cardinal was rendered in brilliant reds and browns, perched on a snow-covered branch with tiny details that spoke of careful observation and genuine artistic talent. That's amazing, Sophia, Danny said, studying the painting with the serious attention it deserved. It looks exactly like a real cardinal. It's Charlie, Sophia explained. He comes to visit me every morning while I eat breakfast. Daddy set up a bird feeder outside my window, so Charlie and his friends have more reasons to stay. Marcus looked at Robert again, seeing the quiet satisfaction of a father who was learning to connect with his daughter's interests rather than imposing his own priorities on her time. After dinner, the children disappeared upstairs to explore Sophia's room while Marcus and Robert settled in the living room with coffee. The evening light filtering through the large windows cast everything in a golden glow that made the expensive surroundings feel warm and inviting rather than intimidating. She seems happier, Marcus observed, listening to the sound of laughter from upstairs, more relaxed. Robert nodded, swirling his coffee thoughtfully. I've been making changes. Smaller schedule, more time at home. I moved my home office so I can see her bird feeder from my desk. He paused. It's amazing how much you notice when you start paying attention. It's not always easy, finding the balance. No, it's not. Especially when you've spent years convincing yourself that providing financially was the same thing as providing emotionally. Robert set down his coffee cup. Can I ask you something? Sure. How do you do it? Work as hard as you do, raise Danny on your own, and still manage to be present for him. Marcus considered the question, thinking about the early mornings and late nights, the careful budgeting that made Danny's school possible, the constant juggling of responsibilities that defines single parenthood. I think it helps that I don't have a choice, he said finally. There's no backup plan, no safety net. If I don't show up for Danny, nobody else will. That clarity makes the decisions easier, even when they're hard. I always thought I was showing up for Sophia by building the company, securing her future. You were, but there's more than one way to show up. Marcus leaned forward. Look, I'm not saying you need to give up your career or stop being successful. But maybe there's a way to include Sophia in your world instead of keeping her separate from it. What do you mean? Take her to work sometimes. Show her what you do, why it matters. Let her see you as more than just the guy who pays for everything. Kids are proud of their parents when they understand what makes them passionate. Robert was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Actually, we're breaking ground on a new community center next month. Affordable housing, public green space, a playground. Sophia might enjoy seeing that. She'd probably love it. Especially if you explained how it's going to help families. Upstairs, the laughter continued, punctuated by the sound of running feet and excited voices. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected, enjoying the easy conversation and the knowledge that Danny was making a genuine friend. "You know," Robert said, "I've been thinking about what you said the other day about starting small. I was wondering if you and Danny might like to join us for dinner once a week. Nothing formal, just a chance for the kids to spend time together." Marcus felt the significance of the invitation, understanding that it represented more than just shared meals. It was Robert's way of committing to being present, to prioritizing his relationship with Sophia over the endless demands of business. "I think we'd like that," Marcus said, "but only if you let us reciprocate. Maybe you and Sophia could come to our place sometime. Danny makes excellent grilled cheese sandwiches." "I'd be honored," Robert said, and he seemed to mean it. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Marcus watched Sophia hug Danny goodbye with the fierce affection of someone who had found a genuine friend. The transformation from the lonely little girl at the birthday party was remarkable. But even more striking was the change in Robert. The man who had seemed so distant and controlled at their first meeting was now animated and engaged, asking Danny about his favorite subjects at school and promising to show both children the construction site for the community center. "Thank you," Robert said as they stood by the front door, "for everything. I feel like I'm starting to remember how to be Sophia's father instead of just her provider." "You're doing great," Marcus said. "The fact that you recognize the need to change is the hardest part." As they drove home through the quiet residential streets, Danny chattered excitedly about Sophia's art supplies and her collection of bird books and the plans they'd made to build a birdhouse together. "Dad," he said as they pulled into their apartment complex, "I really like Sophia and her dad. Can we see them again soon?" "I think that's definitely going to happen," Marcus said, thinking about the weekly dinners Robert had proposed and the gradual building of an unlikely friendship. Later that night, as he tucked Danny into bed, Marcus reflected on how much their lives had changed since that afternoon at the Wellington party. A simple act of kindness toward a lonely child had blossomed into something larger and more meaningful than he could have anticipated. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he was surprised to see it was from Robert's number. "Sophia wanted me to tell you that tonight was the best dinner she's ever had. She's already planning next week's menu. Thank you for helping me see what I was missing. Looking forward to building that birdhouse with the kids this weekend." Marcus smiled, typing back a quick response before turning off the lights. Outside his window, the city sprawled in all directions, millions of people living their separate lives in their separate worlds. But sometimes, if you were lucky and paying attention, those worlds could intersect in ways that changed everything. Sometimes a chance encounter at a children's party could become the foundation for the kind of friendship that made everyone involved better versions of themselves. And sometimes, the most important lessons came not from boardrooms or business schools, but from taking the time to sit on a bench beside a lonely child and asking a simple question: "Where are your parents?" The answer to that question, Marcus was beginning to understand, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire families, and that transformation was just beginning. The Seattle Children's Hospital fundraising gala occupied 3 floors of the Grand Hyatt, transforming the elegant ballroom into a glittering showcase of philanthropy and social networking. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk, while servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with champagne and carefully crafted oars that cost more per bite than most families spent on entire meals. Robert Ashford adjusted his black tie for the 3rd time as he surveyed the crowd from his reserved table near the front of the room. These events were as much a part of his professional obligations as board meetings or contract negotiations. Ashford Industries had been a major sponsor of the Children's Hospital for over a decade, and his presence at fundraising events was both expected and strategically valuable. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as he watched the carefully orchestrated dance of wealth and influence unfold around him, Robert found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with Marcus Rivera 2 weeks earlier about the difference between charity and compassion. "Daddy, my feet hurt." Robert looked down to find Sophia standing beside his chair, her small hand resting on his arm. She wore a navy blue velvet dress with pearl buttons that his stylist had selected for the occasion, paired with patent leather shoes that pinched her toes and white tights that made her legs itch. Her hair was pulled back in an elaborate updo that had required an hour in a salon chair that morning. She looked beautiful and age-appropriate, and exactly like what a successful businessman's daughter should look like at a high-profile charity event. She also looked profoundly uncomfortable. "The program hasn't started yet, sweetheart," Robert said gently, though he was already calculating how much longer they would need to stay for appearance's sake. "Can you manage a little while longer?" Sophia nodded dutifully, but Robert could see the strain in her posture, the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot to relieve the pressure from her shoes. Around them, conversations flowed in the practiced rhythm of people who attended events like this regularly, discussing vacation plans and investment strategies and the latest political developments that might affect their various business interests. "Mr. Ashford." A woman in an emerald green gown approached their table, her smile bright and predatory. "Carolyn Whitmore from Seattle Metropolitan Magazine. I was wondering if I might get a few photos of you and your lovely daughter for our society page?" Robert felt Sophia tense beside him, her small body going rigid with the particular anxiety that came from being scrutinized by strangers. Over the past month, he'd become more attuned to these moments, recognizing the signs of her discomfort in ways he'd previously missed. "Perhaps later," he said politely but firmly. "We're just settling in." Caroline's smile faltered slightly. "Of course. I'll check back after dinner." As she moved away, Robert felt Sophia's hand slip into his, her fingers small and warm against his palm. The gesture was so natural and trusting that it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not making me take pictures right now." Robert squeezed her hand gently, realizing that a month ago he might have agreed to the photos without considering how she felt about them. The old Robert would have seen the magazine coverage as valuable publicity, another opportunity to reinforce the image of Ashford Industries as a family-oriented company led by a devoted father. The new Robert, the one who had been learning to see his daughter as a person rather than an extension of his brand, recognized that Sophia's comfort mattered more than positive press coverage. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "The children's buffet is set up in the adjoining room." Sophia shook her head. "Not really." "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why do we come to these parties? I mean, if we want to help sick children, couldn't we just give them money without having to dress up and eat fancy food?" The question caught Robert off guard with its directness and insight. At 7 years old, Sophia had identified the fundamental contradiction that made him increasingly uncomfortable with events like this: the idea that helping others required elaborate social theater and enormous expenditures on entertainment and luxury. "That's a very good question," he said slowly. "I think sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be. Danny's dad says that helping people should be simple. Like when someone needs food, you share your sandwich. You don't throw a party about sharing your sandwich." Robert smiled, recognizing Marcus's straightforward wisdom in his daughter's words. Over the past month, their weekly dinners had become a source of perspective that Robert hadn't realized he'd been missing. Marcus had a way of cutting through complexity to reach fundamental truths about what mattered and what didn't. Danny's dad is a smart man, Robert said. What else does he say about helping people? Sophia's face lit up with the enthusiasm she always showed when talking about the Rivera family. He says the best kind of helping is when you don't tell anyone about it. Like when he brings groceries to Mrs. Chun next door, because her Social Security check doesn't come until the 15th of the month. Or when he fixes Mr. Peterson's car, because Mr. Peterson's hands shake too much from his medicine. Robert felt something shift in his chest as he listened to his daughter describe acts of kindness that cost nothing but time and attention, gestures that were motivated by genuine compassion rather than social obligation or business strategy. He thought about the check he'd written to the Children's Hospital, substantial enough to earn him recognition and a prominent table placement, and wondered when generosity had become so calculated and public in his world. Mr. Ashford, there. You are. Robert looked up to see James Wellington approaching their table, his wife Catherine following behind with the practiced smile that Robert recognized from dozens of similar events. They were the kind of couple who treated social functions like military campaigns, working the room with strategic precision to maximize their networking opportunities. James, Catherine, good to see you. Wonderful turnout tonight, James. Saad, settling into the chair beside Robert without being invited. I heard the silent auction has already raised over $200,000. That Tuscany vacation package is getting quite competitive. Catherine leaned down to address Sophia, with the condescending tone that adults often used when speaking to children at formal events. And how are you tonight, dear? Don't you look lovely in that pretty dress? Sophia murmured a polite response, but Robert could feel her discomfort radiating through their joined hands. She'd never been comfortable with the performative aspects of these gatherings, the way children were expected to be charming accessories to their parents' social presence. We were just discussing the importance of teaching children about philanthropy, Catherine continued. It's never too early to start instilling values about giving back to the community. Absolutely, James agreed. Though I must say, it's refreshing to see families like yours setting such a positive example. Too many parents these days are raising children who don't understand their responsibilities to society. Robert felt a familiar irritation rising at the casual superiority in James's tone, the assumption that wealth automatically conferred moral authority. A month ago, he might have nodded along with these sentiments, accepting them as part of the social contract that governed his world. But spending time with Marcus and Danny had given him a different perspective on generosity and responsibility. He'd seen how genuine kindness operated in their modest apartment, where helping others was a natural extension of daily life rather than a carefully orchestrated public performance. I think children learn more from observing authentic kindness than from attending formal events, Robert said carefully. Sometimes the most meaningful philanthropy happens quietly, without recognition or fanfare. Catherine's smile became slightly strained. Well, of course. But surely you agree that it's important for children to understand the broader context of charitable giving, the infrastructure that makes large-scale philanthropy possible. Before Robert could respond, Sophia tugged on his sleeve. When he leaned down, she whispered in his ear, "Daddy, can we go check on the sick children? The ones this party is supposed to help?" Her question was innocent and logical, but it highlighted the absurdity of an event that claimed to benefit hospitalized children while taking place miles away from the hospital itself, surrounded by luxury and excess that bore no relationship to the medical crisis the fundraising was meant to address. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," Robert said, making a sudden decision. "Why don't we do exactly that?" James and Catherine exchanged glances, clearly confused by the direction the conversation had taken. "Do what?" Catherine asked. "Visit the Children's Hospital," Robert said, standing and helping Sophia to her feet. "Since we're here to support them, it seems appropriate to actually see the people we're trying to help." "But Robert," James protested, The program is about to begin. You're receiving the Community Leadership Award tonight. You can't leave before the presentation. Robert looked at the stage where the evening speakers were beginning to gather, then down at his daughter, who was watching him with curious eyes that seemed to be asking whether he would choose obligation or authenticity. I think the award will have more meaning if I've actually spent time with the children it's supposed to represent, he said. 20 minutes later, Robert and Sophia walked through the automatic doors of Seattle Children's Hospital, having traded the glittering ballroom for the fluorescent-lit corridors of the pediatric wing. Robert had called ahead to arrange an impromptu visit, using his status as a major donor to gain access outside normal visiting hours. The contrast between the hospital and the gala was stark and immediate. Instead of crystal and silk, they found linoleum floors and institutional furniture designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. Instead of champagne and orchestrated conversation, they encountered the quiet efficiency of medical professionals working through the night shift. "It's very quiet," Sophia observed as they followed a nurse named Patricia down the hallway toward the patient rooms. "Most of the children are sleeping," Patricia explained. "But there are a few who are awake if you'd like to say hello. We don't usually have visitors this late, but the night can get long for kids who can't sleep." She led them to a common area where several children were gathered around a television, some in wheelchairs, others connected to portable four-stands. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5, while the oldest looked to be around 12. They were watching an animated movie, their attention completely absorbed in the adventures unfolding on screen. "Everyone, we have some special visitors tonight," Patricia announced gently. "This is Mr. Ashford and his daughter Sophia. Mr. Ashford's company helps support our hospital." The children looked up with the polite interest that kids reserved for unfamiliar adults, but their expressions became more animated when they focused on Sophia. "Hi," said a girl with a bright pink headscarf and enormous brown eyes. "I'm Emma. Are you here because you're sick too?" Sophia shook her head then looked up at Robert as if seeking permission to explain their presence. He nodded encouragingly. "We were at a party to raise money for the hospital," Sophia said. "But I wanted to meet the kids the party was supposed to help." "That's cool," said a boy whose leg was elevated in a complex brace. "I'm Tyler. What kind of party?" Sophia described the gala with the matter-of-fact honesty that children brought to most situations, explaining the fancy dresses and expensive food and silent auction items. The hospitalized children listened with fascination, asking questions about the ballroom and the chandeliers and whether the food was actually good or just looked fancy. "It sounds pretty," Emma said, "but kind of boring. Did you have fun?" Sophia considered the question seriously. "Not really. My shoes hurt and I didn't know anyone and everyone talked about stuff I didn't understand." She paused, then added, "This is more fun." Robert watched this exchange with growing amazement. Within minutes, Sophia had connected with these children in ways that felt genuine and unforced. She asked about their favorite movies and showed them pictures on his phone of the birds that visited her window at home. She listened to their stories about treatments and procedures with the kind of focused attention that made each child feel heard and valued. "What's that?" Tyler asked, pointing to a drawing that Sophia had pulled from her small purse. "It's a cardinal named Charlie," Sophia explained. "He visits me every morning. My dad and I have been learning about birds together." She showed them the drawing with obvious pride, and Robert felt a surge of warmth at being included in her explanation. The bird watching had become one of their most consistent shared activities, something that belonged uniquely to their relationship. "That's really good," Emma said admiringly. "I like to draw too, but mostly I draw the view from my window here. It's just other buildings and parking lots." "Maybe you could draw birds too," Sophia suggested. "Even if you can't see them from your window, you could imagine what they look like. I could bring you my bird book next time. You'd come back?" Tyler asked, his voice carrying a note of hope that made Robert's chest tighten. "If it's okay with everyone," Sophia said, looking around the room before settling her gaze on Robert. "Daddy, could we visit again sometime?" Robert found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications of the commitment. "I think that would be wonderful." They spent another hour at the hospital, with Sophia gravitating naturally between the children while Robert found himself in conversation with Patricia and other staff members about the reality of pediatric care. He learned about funding shortfalls and equipment needs, about families who couldn't afford parking fees during long hospital stays and parents who slept in chairs because they couldn't bear to leave their children alone. The problems were complex and systemic, requiring solutions that went far beyond charitable donations and fundraising galas. But they were also immediate and human, affecting real families who needed practical support rather than symbolic gestures. "Your daughter has a gift," Patricia told him as they prepared to leave. "She made those kids feel normal tonight, like they were just children having a conversation rather than patients being visited by donors." On the drive home, Sophia was quiet, staring out the window at the city lights that blurred past their car. Robert could sense that she was processing the evening's experiences, trying to make sense of the contrast between the gala's luxury and the hospital's stark reality. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" he asked as they pulled into their driveway. "Those kids are really sick," Sophia said softly, "but they're still just kids. They like movies and drawing and hearing about birds." "That's right. The party tonight raised money to help them, right?" "Yes." Sophia was quiet for another moment. "I think the money is important, but I think visiting them might be important too. Maybe more important." Robert turned off the engine and sat in the darkness of the garage, considering his daughter's words. She was right, of course. The financial support was necessary and valuable, but the human connection they'd experienced tonight had felt more meaningful than any check he'd ever written. "You know what?" he said. "I think you're absolutely right." Later that night, after Sophia had been tucked into bed with stories about brave children and healing birds, Robert sat in his home office composing an email to the hospital's development director. He proposed a new kind of partnership, one that would involve regular visits and direct engagement rather than just financial contributions. He also sent a message to Marcus, describing the evening's events and Sophia's insights about the difference between helping and connecting. Marcus's response came quickly. "Sounds like you're both learning to see with your hearts instead of just your heads. That's the best kind of education." As Robert prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the children they'd met at the hospital, about Emma's drawings and Tyler's questions, and the way Sophia had naturally created connections that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Tomorrow he would return to the world of contracts and negotiations and strategic planning. But tonight had shown him that there were other ways to measure success, other currencies that mattered more than profit margins or market share. And at the center of it all was his daughter, teaching him through her questions and observations that the most important gifts couldn't be purchased or awarded or recognized at formal ceremonies. They were found in moments of genuine human connection, in the simple act of showing up and paying attention and caring about people for who they were rather than what they represented. The Community Leadership Award sat forgotten on a shelf in the hotel ballroom, but Robert felt like he'd received something far more valuable, a lesson in authentic generosity from a 7-year-old girl who understood instinctively that helping others meant seeing them as people rather than causes. And that lesson, he realized, was worth more than all the recognition and accolades that his old life had considered measures of success. The following Saturday morning found Robert and Sophia standing outside a modest 2-story building in the Fremont neighborhood, studying the weathered sign that read Sunrise Community Center. The structure looked like it had seen better decades, with peeling paint and windows that could use a thorough cleaning. But the small playground beside it was full of children whose laughter carried across the parking lot. "This is where Danny and his dad volunteer?" Sophia asked, clutching a box of art supplies they'd purchased that morning. "Every Saturday," Robert confirmed, though he was still processing Marcus's invitation to join them for what he'd called real community work. After their conversation about the hospital visit, Marcus had suggested that Robert and Sophia might enjoy seeing how grassroots assistance operated in neighborhoods that rarely benefited from high-profile fundraising galas. They found Marcus in the center's main room, wearing jeans and a faded Seahawks t-shirt while he helped set up folding tables for what appeared to be a combination food pantry and homework assistance program. Danny was nearby, organizing donated books into neat piles while chatting easily with several other children who had clearly claimed him as a friend. "You made it," Marcus said, looking up with the genuine smile that Robert had come to associate with authentic welcome rather than social obligation. "Perfect timing. We're just getting started." The scene that unfolded over the next few hours challenged every assumption Robert had held about effective charitable work. There were no elaborate organizational charts or strategic planning committees. No publicity materials or donor recognition programs. Instead, there was simply a collection of neighbors helping neighbors with whatever was needed most urgently. Robert watched as a grandmother named Mrs. Rodriguez taught English to recent immigrants while their children played in a supervised corner. He observed teenagers from the local high school helping elementary students with reading homework while their parents attended a financial literacy workshop led by a retired banker who volunteered his time every weekend. "It's not glamorous," Marcus explained as they worked together to organize donated clothing into size categories. "But it's consistent. Same time every week, same commitment to showing up for people who need support." Sophia had gravitated immediately toward the children's area, where she'd set up an impromptu art station with the supplies they'd brought. Within minutes, she was surrounded by kids of various ages who were eager to try the high-quality markers and colored pencils that were clearly a luxury in their daily lives. "She's good with them," observed a woman named Janet who managed the center's operations with the kind of cheerful efficiency that came from years of stretching limited resources to meet unlimited needs. "Most volunteers take weeks to connect with the kids like that." Robert watched his daughter help a shy boy named Miguel create a drawing of his pet lizard, noting how naturally she encouraged his artistic efforts without trying to direct or control the outcome. Her weeks of visiting the children's hospital had taught her something about meeting people where they were rather than where she thought they should be. "Marcus tells me you're interested in learning about community-level support work," Janet continued. "What's got you curious about getting your hands dirty?" The question was direct but friendly, carrying none of the suspicious undertones that Robert might have expected from someone who had probably seen plenty of wealthy volunteers who showed up once for photos and tax write-offs before disappearing back to their comfortable lives. "My daughter is teaching me that there's a difference between writing checks and actually helping people," Robert said. "I'm trying to understand what authentic assistance looks like." Janet nodded approvingly. "Smart kid. Most adults take years to figure that out, if they ever do." As the morning progressed, Robert found himself assigned to various tasks that bore no relationship to his professional expertise, but required the kind of basic human competence that he'd somehow lost touch with in his insulated corporate world. He helped sort canned goods by expiration date, assisted elderly visitors with paperwork for social services, and spent 20 minutes on his hands and knees helping a toddler retrieve toy cars that had rolled under tables. None of it was particularly challenging from an intellectual standpoint, but all of it required a presence and attention that felt different from the strategic thinking that dominated his business life. Here, success was measured in immediate, tangible ways. A family had groceries for the week. A child understood a difficult math concept. An elderly man had someone to listen to his concerns about his medication. "Different from your usual Saturday, I'm guessing," Marcus said during A brief break, finding Robert restocking shelves in the food pantry area. Completely different, Robert admitted. But good different. Eye-opening different. How so? Robert paused in his organizing to consider the question. I think I've been operating under the assumption that helping people required complex systems and large amounts of money. But watching you and the other volunteers here, I'm seeing that most of what people need is pretty basic. Food. Attention, someone who cares enough to show up consistently. Marcus smiled. Took me a while to learn that too. When Danny's mom left, I kept thinking I needed to find some big solution to fix everything that was broken. But it turned out the healing happened through small, daily choices. Making breakfast together, reading bedtime stories, showing up for school events. The ordinary stuff. The ordinary stuff, Robert repeated, thinking about his recent attempts to rebuild his relationship with Sophia through shared birdwatching and regular dinners and hospital visits. I'm starting to understand that. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to leave the community center, Sophia ran up to Robert with a drawing that one of the children had made for her. It showed two figures holding hands under a rainbow with the words, "Thank you for the art supplies," written in careful second-grade handwriting. "Miguel made this for me," she said, her face glowing with the particular joy that came from receiving a gift that had been created rather than purchased. "He wants to know if we'll come back next week." Robert looked at Marcus, who was watching this interaction with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had anticipated exactly this outcome. "What do you think?" Marcus asked. "You up for making this a regular thing?" Robert thought about his upcoming calendar, filled with meetings and conference calls and the endless administrative tasks that comprised corporate leadership. Then he looked at his daughter's hopeful expression and remembered the lesson she'd taught him at the hospital about the difference between helping and connecting. "I think we can make room for what matters," he said, as they drove home through the quiet residential streets of Fremont. Sophia chattered excitedly about the friends she'd made and the art projects they'd planned for future visits. Robert found himself only half listening to her words while absorbing the deeper significance of her enthusiasm. For the first time in years, his daughter was excited about something that had nothing to do with expensive purchases or exclusive experiences. She was animated about the prospect of spending time with children who had very little material wealth, but who had welcomed her with genuine warmth and friendship. "Daddy," she said as they pulled into their driveway, "I like helping people the way Marcus and Danny do. It feels more real than the fancy parties." "More real how?" Sophia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to important topics. "Like we're actually making friends instead of just pretending to care about people we don't really know." That evening, as Robert tucked Sophia into bed, she asked if they could start volunteering at the community center every Saturday instead of just occasionally. "It's a big commitment," he warned, though he was already mentally rearranging his schedule to accommodate the request. "The best things are," Sophia said, repeating something she'd clearly heard from Marcus. "Besides, Miguel is teaching me Spanish, and Mrs. Rodriguez wants to learn about birds. I think Charlie would like her." Robert kissed his daughter goodnight and returned to his home office, where he spent the evening researching community development programs and grassroots assistance organizations. What he discovered was a vast network of people who had dedicated their lives to addressing problems at the neighborhood level, working with limited resources and unlimited commitment to create meaningful change in individual lives. It was a world that operated according to different principles than his business environment, valuing consistency over efficiency, relationship over profit, presence over position. And for the first time in his professional career, Robert found himself wondering if he might have something to learn from people who measured success by entirely different standards. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Thanks for today. Sophia's a natural at this work. So are you, by the way." Robert smiled, typing back, Thank you for showing us what authentic service looks like. See you next Saturday." As he prepared for bed, Robert realized that his definition of success was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The metrics that had driven his decisions for decades, revenue growth, market share, competitive advantage, were beginning to feel less important than new questions. Was he raising a daughter who understood her responsibility to others? Was he contributing to his community in ways that created lasting value? Was he building relationships based on genuine care rather than strategic benefit? The answers to those questions, he was learning, couldn't be found in boardrooms or balance sheets. They were discovered in community centers and hospital corridors, in art supplies shared with children who had never owned high-quality markers, in the simple act of showing up consistently for people who needed support. And at the center of this transformation was his daughter, whose natural compassion and authentic curiosity were teaching him that the most important kind of leadership had nothing to do with corporate hierarchies and everything to do with recognizing the humanity in every person he encountered. It was a lesson worth learning, even if it meant starting over at age 42 with a 7-year-old teacher who understood instinctively what he was only beginning to discover. The emergency call came at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, interrupting a board meeting that had been scheduled for weeks. Robert's assistant Jennifer appeared in the doorway of the conference room with an expression that immediately commanded his attention, her usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Mr. Ashford, I need to speak with you immediately." Robert excused himself from the meeting, following Jennifer into the hallway where she could speak without the entire board overhearing. "It's Sophia," she said without preamble. "Maria called from the school. There's been an incident." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, his mind immediately jumping to the worst possible scenarios. Car accident, medical emergency, some kind of violence that had somehow penetrated the supposedly secure environment of Sacred Heart Academy. What kind of incident? "Is she hurt?" "She's not physically injured," Jennifer said quickly, recognizing his panic. But apparently there was some kind of confrontation with other students. "The principal wants to see you immediately." Robert was already moving toward the elevator, pulling out his phone to call his driver, while Jennifer hurried to keep pace beside him. The 20-minute drive to Sacred Heart felt like hours, his imagination filling the silence with increasingly dire possibilities about what could have happened to his daughter. Sacred Heart Academy occupied a pristine campus in one of Seattle's most exclusive neighborhoods, its brick buildings and manicured grounds designed to convey the kind of educational excellence that justified its astronomical tuition fees. Robert had chosen the school carefully, researching its academic programs and college placement statistics with the same thoroughness he brought to business acquisitions. But as he walked through the familiar hallways toward the principal's office, Robert found himself wondering if he'd focused on the wrong criteria when selecting Sophia's educational environment. Principal Margaret Davidson was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of measured authority that came from decades of managing affluent families and their complex expectations. She rose from behind her desk when Robert entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for coming so quickly. Please have a seat." Robert remained standing, his anxiety making it impossible to settle into the offered chair. "Where is Sophia? What happened?" "Sophia is in the nurse's office, and she's perfectly safe," Principal Davidson said, gesturing toward the chair again. "But we need to discuss the situation that occurred during lunch period today." Reluctantly, Robert sat down, his hands gripping the armrests as he waited for an explanation that seemed to be taking far too long to arrive. "There was an altercation between Sophia and several other students in her grade," Principal Davidson began. "According to witnesses, it started when a group of children were discussing their family's holiday plans. Apparently, some of the children were talking about expensive vacations and exclusive resorts." Robert felt his stomach tighten, sensing where this conversation was heading. One of the students, Madison Pierce, mentioned that her family was spending Christmas at their private island in the Caribbean. Another child, Harrison Webb, talked about their ski lodge in Aspen. The conversation became increasingly competitive, with children trying to outdo each other with descriptions of luxury experiences. Principal Davidson paused, consulting notes that she'd evidently taken after interviewing the students involved. According to multiple witnesses, Sophia became visibly upset during this conversation. When Madison asked about the Ashford family's holiday plans, Sophia apparently stood up and said, quite loudly, that she would rather spend Christmas helping sick children at the hospital than sitting on some stupid island where people pretended to be happy. Despite his concern, Robert felt a surge of pride at his daughter's response. But Principal Davidson's expression suggested that the story was far from over. Madison apparently took offense to being called stupid and responded by saying that at least her father cared enough to plan special trips for their family. She suggested that Sophia was just jealous because her father was too busy with work to spend time with her. Robert's hands tightened on the armrests, his protective instincts flaring at the idea of another child attacking his relationship with Sophia. How did Sophia respond? Principal Davidson's expression grew more troubled. This is where the situation escalated beyond typical childhood disagreement. Sophia told Madison that having money didn't make someone a good person, and that some of the kindest people she knew lived in apartments and drove old cars. She specifically mentioned a friend named Danny, whose father worked as a delivery driver. Robert could picture the scene unfolding in the school cafeteria, his daughter defending the Rivera family with the passionate conviction that only children could bring to questions of fundamental fairness. Madison's response was particularly concerning, Principal Davidson continued. She said, and I quote, "My mother says people like that are just trying to use rich families for money. She says your father should be more careful about who he lets you associate with." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Robert felt anger rising in his chest at the casual cruelty and prejudice that this child had obviously absorbed from her parents. What happened then? According to witnesses, Sophia became very angry. She told Madison that she didn't know what she was talking about, that Marcus and Danny were the nicest people she'd ever met, and that Madison's mother sounded like a mean person who judged others without knowing them. Principal Davidson set down her notes and looked directly at Robert. The situation might have ended there, but Madison apparently decided to escalate further. She said that everyone knew Sophia's father didn't really care about her, that he sent her to school events with nannies instead of coming himself, and that at least Madison's parents actually wanted to spend time with her. Robert felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The accusation was cruel and cutting precisely because it contained elements of truth that he'd been working to address. For years, he had missed school events and relied on Maria to handle Sophia's daily needs while he focused on business obligations. Sophia's response was to push Madison, Principal Davidson said. Not hard enough to cause injury, but forcefully. Enough to knock her backward into another student. That's when the teachers intervened. Is Madison hurt? She's fine physically, though quite upset. Her parents are being notified as well. Principal Davidson leaned forward slightly. Mr. Ashford, I need you to understand that Sacred Heart has a zero-tolerance policy regarding physical altercations. Normally, this kind of incident would result in immediate suspension. Robert felt his world tilting slightly. Sophia had never been in trouble at school, had never shown any tendency toward violence or aggression. The idea that his gentle, thoughtful daughter had been pushed to the point of physical confrontation was deeply disturbing. However, Principal Davidson continued, given the circumstances and the testimony of other students about the verbal provocation that preceded the physical incident, we're prepared to handle this as an educational opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter. What does that mean? Both girls will need to write letters of apology and attend conflict resolution sessions with our school counselor. They'll also be required to work together on a community service project as a way of learning to resolve differences constructively. Robert nodded, though his mind was still processing the deeper implications of what had happened. The incident had exposed fault lines in the school's social dynamics that he'd never considered, revealing the kind of casual classism and prejudice that his daughter was encountering on a daily basis. "I'd like to see Sophia now," he said. Principal Davidson led him to the nurse's office, where he found his daughter sitting on a small cot with red-rimmed eyes and a crumpled tissue in her hand. When she saw him, her face crumpled with relief and residual upset. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have pushed Madison, but she said such mean things about you and Marcus and Danny." Robert sat down beside her on the cot, pulling her into a hug that was as much for his own comfort as hers. "It's okay, sweetheart. Let's talk about what happened." Sophia's version of events matched what Principal Davidson had described, but with additional emotional context that made Robert's heart ache. She described the humiliation of listening to her classmates compete over luxury experiences, the growing realization that her life was different from theirs in ways that she was only beginning to understand. "I don't care about stupid islands or ski lodges," she said through renewed tears. "I just want to spend time with you and help people like we do at the hospital and the community center." But Madison made it sound like that was wrong, like Marcus and Danny weren't good enough to be our friends. Robert held her tighter, understanding that this incident was about much more than a schoolyard argument. It was his daughter's first real encounter with the kind of social prejudice and class consciousness that permeated their world, her introduction to the idea that some people believed their wealth made them inherently superior to others. "Marcus and Danny are wonderful people," he said firmly. "Some of the best people I've ever known. And you were right to defend them. But I shouldn't have pushed Madison." "No, you shouldn't have. Physical violence is never the right way to handle disagreements, even when you're very angry. But I understand why you were upset, and I'm proud of you for standing up for your friends." They drove home in relative silence, Sophia curled up in the passenger seat while Robert wrestled with the implications of the day's events. The incident had forced him to confront questions about Sophia's social environment that he'd been avoiding, to acknowledge that the world of privilege he'd worked so hard to provide for her came with complications he hadn't anticipated. That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Robert found himself sitting in his home office with a glass of wine and a stack of Sacred Heart Academy promotional materials that he'd never really read carefully. The glossy brochures emphasized academic excellence and college preparation, but they also contained subtler messages about exclusivity and social positioning that suddenly seemed troubling. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "I heard about what happened at school today," Marcus said without preamble. "How is Sophia doing?" Robert wasn't surprised that Marcus had learned about the incident. Danny and Sophia had become close enough that news traveled quickly between their families. "She's upset, but she'll be okay. How did you find out?" Danny mentioned that some kids at school were saying mean things about Sophia getting in trouble for defending her poor friends. Apparently, word travels fast in private school circles. Robert closed his eyes, realizing that the story would probably be distorted and embellished as it spread through the school community. "I'm sorry, Marcus. This whole situation is my fault. How do you figure that?" "I chose that school without really thinking about the social environment. I focused on academics and reputation without considering what kind of values the other families might be teaching their children." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You know, I've been thinking about that too. Not specifically about Sacred Heart, but about the challenge of raising kids who understand their privilege without becoming entitled by it. Danny doesn't seem to have that problem. Danny's never had to navigate the world Sophia lives in. It's easy to be humble when you don't have much. It's harder when you have everything, but you're trying to understand why that doesn't make you better than other people. Robert appreciated Marcus's perspective, but it didn't alleviate his concern about the environment he'd created for his daughter. I'm starting to wonder if I've made a mistake, surrounding her with children who've been taught that wealth equals worth. Maybe, Marcus said. Or maybe this is exactly the kind of challenge she needs to develop her own moral compass. The question isn't whether she encountered prejudice and entitlement, it's how she chooses to respond to it. Over the following days, Robert watched Sophia navigate the aftermath of the incident with a maturity that surprised him. She wrote a thoughtful letter of apology to Madison, acknowledging that physical confrontation was inappropriate while maintaining her position that judging people based on their financial circumstances was wrong. The conflict resolution sessions with the school counselor seemed to help both girls understand the dynamics that had led to their argument, and the required community service project gave them an opportunity to work together constructively rather than competitively. But the incident had also prompted deeper conversations between Robert and Sophia about wealth, privilege, and responsibility that felt both necessary and difficult. Why do some people think having money makes them better than other people? Sophia asked one evening as they watched the birds at her window feeder. Robert considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer without overwhelming her with the complexities of class dynamics and social psychology. I think sometimes when people have a lot of something, whether it's money or success or recognition, they start to believe that they earned it entirely through their own efforts. He said, they forget about the advantages they had, the help they received, or the luck that played a role in their circumstances. But you work really hard for our money. I do work hard. But I also had advantages that not everyone has. I went to good schools. I had parents who supported my education. I started my career without having to worry about supporting a family or paying off student loans. Those advantages made it easier for me to succeed. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. So having money isn't bad, but thinking you're better because you have it is bad? Exactly. Money is a tool that can be used to help people or to separate yourself from people. The choice is what matters. These conversations were happening against the backdrop of their continued volunteer work at the community center and the hospital, experiences that provided concrete examples of how privilege could be used constructively rather than divisively. Robert noticed that Sophia seemed more confident and purposeful in these environments, more comfortable with her identity as someone who had resources and wanted to share them meaningfully. One Saturday morning at the community center, Robert overheard Sophia explaining to a new volunteer why she enjoyed the work so much. My dad and I used to go to fancy parties where people talked about helping others, she said. But here we actually get to know the people we're helping. We're friends with them, not just donors. The distinction she drew between charity and relationship reflected a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics that impressed the adults around her. She was learning to navigate her privilege consciously, using her advantages to create connections rather than maintain distance. 3 weeks after the school incident, Robert received a call from Principal Davidson requesting another meeting. This time, however, her tone suggested good news rather than crisis management. I wanted to update you on how Sophia and Madison have been working together on their community service project, she said when Robert arrived at her office. They've been volunteering at a local animal shelter, and according to the staff there, they've developed quite a partnership. Robert was intrigued. The animal shelter assignment had been Sophia's choice, reflecting her growing interest in caring for vulnerable creatures. Apparently, they've discovered that they work well together when they're focused on helping others rather than competing with each other. Principal Davidson continued. The shelter coordinator says they've been exceptionally responsible and compassionate volunteers. That's encouraging. More than encouraging, I think. It suggests that both girls are capable of moving beyond the social dynamics that caused their initial conflict. Principal Davidson paused. I wanted to mention this because it relates to a broader conversation we've been having among the faculty about how to address some of the social issues that contributed to this incident. Robert leaned forward, interested in hearing how the school planned to address the underlying problems rather than just managing the symptoms. We're implementing a new program focused on social responsibility and community engagement, she explained. Rather than simply teaching about different economic backgrounds in the abstract, we want students to have direct experience working with people from various circumstances. That sounds promising. We're hoping that families like yours, who are already engaged in meaningful community service, might be willing to help mentor other families who want to get involved but aren't sure where to start. Robert considered the proposal, recognizing an opportunity to help other privileged children develop the kind of perspective that Sophia was gaining through her work with Marcus and the Rivera family. I think we'd be very interested in participating, he said. That evening, as Robert shared the news with Sophia, he watched her face light up with enthusiasm about the possibility of helping her classmates discover the joy of authentic service. Maybe Madison could come to the hospital with us sometime, she suggested. I think she'd really like Emma and Tyler. The generosity of spirit that allowed Sophia to include her former adversary in future plans reflected a level of emotional maturity that Robert found both impressive and humbling. His daughter was learning to respond to conflict with inclusion rather than exclusion, with understanding rather than judgment. As they prepared for bed that night, Sophia asked a question that caught Robert off guard with its insight. Daddy, do you think the reason some kids at school are mean about money is because their parents never taught them how to be friends with people who don't have as much? Robert paused in tucking her blankets, struck by the accuracy of her observation. I think that might be exactly right, sweetheart. Then maybe if we show them how to be real friends with people like Marcus and Danny, they'll learn that having money isn't the most important thing about a person. As Robert kissed his daughter goodnight and turned off her bedroom light, he reflected on how much their lives had changed since that afternoon at the Wellington party when Marcus had asked a simple question about where her parents were. That moment of genuine concern from a stranger had set in motion a series of events that had transformed not just Robert's relationship with Sophia, but their entire understanding of what it meant to live meaningfully in a world of profound inequality. The incident at school had been painful but necessary, forcing them to confront the social dynamics that surrounded their privilege, and to make conscious choices about how they wanted to engage with their community. And through it all, Sophia had emerged as both student and teacher, learning to navigate complex social terrain while maintaining the authentic compassion that had first drawn Marcus to her side when she sat alone on a bench, waiting for someone to notice that she needed a friend. Now she was becoming the kind of person who noticed when others needed friends, who used her advantages to create inclusion rather than exclusion, who understood that true wealth was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you shared with others. It was a lesson that Robert was still learning, guided by a 7-year-old girl who somehow understood intuitively that the most important gifts couldn't be purchased or inherited, but could only be developed through the daily practice of treating every person as worthy of dignity, respect, and genuine care. 6 months later, the transformation was complete, but so gradual that Robert could barely remember who they used to be. The Ashford Industries annual holiday party had always been held in the ballroom of the Four Seasons, a glittering affair designed to impress clients and reward employees with an evening of luxury. This year, however, the party was taking place in the gymnasium of the Sunrise Community Center, decorated with handmade ornaments created by the children who used the facility daily. Robert stood near the buffet table, watching Sophia help serve dinner to a line that included both his corporate executives and families from the neighborhood. She wore a simple red dress that she'd chosen herself, practical enough for the work of hosting, but festive enough for celebration. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail secured with a ribbon that Emma from the Children's Hospital had made for her during one of their weekly art sessions. "This is certainly different," observed Janet Morrison, Ashford Industries head of marketing, as she accepted a plate of homemade lasagna from Mrs. Rodriguez, who had insisted on contributing her famous recipe to the evening's menu. "Different how?" Robert asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "More authentic. I suppose less performance, more actual celebration." The evening had been Sophia's idea, proposed during one of their regular family planning sessions that had replaced Robert's old habit of making unilateral decisions about their social obligations. She had suggested that instead of renting an expensive venue to impress people who already knew the company was successful, they could host the party somewhere that would benefit the community they'd been serving together. The guest list reflected this philosophy. Alongside the usual corporate attendees were families from the community center, staff from the Children's Hospital, and neighbors from Marcus and Danny's apartment complex. The conversations flowing around the room bridged worlds that had never intersected before, creating connections based on shared values rather than shared income brackets. Mr. Ashford. Tyler, the boy from the hospital whom Sophia had befriended months earlier, approached with his parents in tow. His leg brace was gone, replaced by a slight limp that barely slowed his enthusiastic movement. "Sophia said you're the one who makes sure the hospital has money for art supplies." Robert smiled, crouching down to Tyler's eye level. "Sophia's the one who convinced me that art supplies were important. I just write the checks." "Well, thank you. I've been painting every day since I got out of the hospital. Mom says I might be good enough for art classes someday." Tyler's mother, a woman whose tired eyes spoke of months spent in hospital waiting rooms, extended her hand to Robert. "Mr. Ashford, I can't adequately express what your daughter's visits meant to Tyler during his treatment. She made him feel normal when nothing else in his world was normal." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a microphone being tested. Marcus stood near the small stage that had been set up for the evening's program, looking slightly uncomfortable with the formal attention but determined to fulfill his role as master of ceremonies. "If I could have everyone's attention," Marcus began, his voice carrying the easy authority that Robert had come to associate with authentic leadership. "We wanted to take a moment tonight to recognize what this community has accomplished together over the past year." Robert watched as Marcus outlined the various initiatives that had grown from their initial volunteer work, the expansion of the community center's programs, the new pediatric art therapy wing at the hospital, the scholarship fund that would send 3 neighborhood children to Sacred Heart Academy next fall. "But the real accomplishment," Marcus continued, "isn't measured in dollars donated or programs created. It's measured in relationships built, in walls broken down, in children learning that differences in circumstances don't have to mean differences in worth." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, reflecting the kind of appreciation that couldn't be manufactured or purchased. Robert felt Sophia slip her hand into his as they clapped, her grip firm and confident in the way of children who had learned to trust their place in the world. "Now," Marcus said, "I'd like to ask Sophia Ashford to come up here for a minute." Sophia looked up at Robert with surprise, clearly not having expected to be part of the program. He squeezed her hand encouragingly, and she made her way to the stage with the composed walk that she'd developed through months of public speaking at fundraising events. "Sophia," Marcus said, kneeling down so they were at the same height, "do you remember what you asked me the first day we met at the community center?" Sophia nodded, her voice clear as she answered into the microphone. "I asked why we couldn't just help people without having parties about helping people." Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of appreciative response that recognized truth delivered with childlike directness. "And what did we learn about that?" Marcus prompted. "We learned that sometimes parties can be about bringing different kinds of people together instead of keeping them apart. And that celebrating helping people is different from celebrating yourself for helping people." The distinction she drew was subtle but profound. reflecting the kind of nuanced understanding that had developed through months of genuine engagement with people whose lives were very different from her own. Robert watched his daughter field questions from the audience about her volunteer work, her friendship with the children at the hospital, and her plans for the scholarship program that would help other kids experience the kind of educational opportunities she'd always taken for granted. When someone asked what she'd learned from all her volunteer work, Sophia was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I learned that being rich doesn't make you better than other people, but it can make you more able to help other people. And I learned that the best kind of helping is when you become real friends with people, not just when you give them stuff." After the formal program ended, the party continued with dancing and games organized by the children themselves. Robert found himself in conversation with Emma's grandmother, who had driven in from Tacoma to attend the celebration. "Your daughter has a gift," the elderly woman told him. "Not for wealth or privilege, but for seeing people clearly. That's rarer than you might think." Robert accepted the compliment while watching Sophia lead a group of children in an elaborate line dance that seemed to have no rules beyond enthusiasm and inclusion. Danny was beside her, as he had been at most significant moments over the past months, their friendship having evolved into the kind of deep bond that would likely last well beyond childhood. "She's had good teachers," Robert replied, thinking about Marcus and the other volunteers who had shown them both how to engage authentically with their community. As the evening wound down, Robert helped with cleanup while Sophia said goodbye to friends who ranged from hospital staff to corporate executives to 7-year-olds who attended the community center's after-school programs. The ease with which she moved between these different groups reflected a social confidence that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with genuine interest in other people. "Ready to head home?" Robert asked when the last guest had departed and the gymnasium had been restored to its usual configuration. "Almost," Sophia said. "I want to check on Charlie first." She led him outside to where they'd installed a special bird feeder earlier that week, designed to provide food for the urban wildlife that lived around the community center. The feeder was already attracting visitors, and they stood quietly in the December cold watching sparrows and finches share the evening meal. "Do you think Charlie might come here too?" Sophia asked, referring to the cardinal that still visited their home every morning. "I think Charlie goes wherever he knows he'll be welcomed," Robert said. As they drove home through the quiet residential streets, Sophia talked excitedly about the plans she and Danny had made for expanding their volunteer work, including a summer program that would bring children from different economic backgrounds together for shared service projects. "Madison wants to help too," she added, referring to her former adversary who had become an unlikely ally in their community work. "She says her parents are interested in learning about meaningful philanthropy instead of just going to fancy fundraisers." Robert smiled at the phrase, recognizing the language of adults who were trying to follow their children's lead toward more authentic engagement with their privilege. When they reached home, Robert tucked Sophia into bed with the same ritual they'd maintained throughout all the changes in their lives. But tonight, as he listened to her prayers, he noticed that she no longer asked for things for herself. Instead, she expressed gratitude for the friends she'd made and asked for help in using her advantages to make other people's lives better. "Thank you for Charlie and Emma and Tyler and Mrs. Rodriguez and Marcus and Danny and everyone at the community center," she said. "And thank you for helping Daddy learn how to be my friend and not just my provider." The distinction she drew between friendship and provision reflected an understanding of relationship that had taken Robert decades to develop. His daughter had learned, through their shared work and their deepening connection, that love was demonstrated through presence and attention rather than through material gifts or financial security. After Sophia fell asleep, Robert sat in his home office reviewing the financial reports that documented the year's charitable giving. The numbers were substantial, reflecting a level of community investment that had transformed Ashford Industries. reputation from successful corporation to engaged community partner. But the real transformation wasn't captured in financial statements or tax deductions. It was evident in the relationships that had developed, in the children who had learned to see beyond economic differences, in the adults who had discovered that authentic connection required vulnerability rather than superiority. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Thank you for tonight. Sophia continues to amaze everyone who meets her. You should be proud of the person she's becoming." Robert typed back, "Thank you for asking where her parents were that day at the party." That question changed everything. As he prepared for bed, Robert reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with a simple act of kindness toward a lonely child, but it had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful. A complete reconstruction of how they understood wealth, responsibility, and relationship. The old Robert had measured success through market share and profit margins, had demonstrated love through expensive gifts and exclusive experiences, had engaged with charity as a tax strategy and networking opportunity. The new Robert measured success through his daughter's authentic friendships, demonstrated love through consistent presence and shared values, and engaged with charity as an expression of genuine care for community well-being. And at the center of this transformation was Sophia, who had learned to use her advantages not to separate herself from others, but to create bridges between different worlds. She had become the kind of person who noticed when others felt alone, who used her resources to lift others up rather than to elevate herself above them. It was exactly the kind of person Robert had always wanted her to become, even when he hadn't known how to help her get there. And it had all started with a stranger who had cared enough to sit down beside a lonely child and ask a simple question. That had changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.